Tell me, what happened in Russia in the 90s with Boris Yeltsin, the politics, including selling off most state assets, that was primarily on the advice from professors from the United States of America that flew in,
I mean, certainly the crash privatization campaign was heavily pushed by various sort of American neoliberal advisors or whatever. But at the same time, I mean, the reason why it was adopted was it also went with the grain of what Yeltsin and his friends wanted. They were terrified that the communists would come back to power, and so in some ways they wanted to move as many assets out of state control as possible. And from their point of view, and this is where the American advisors came in, it didn't matter so much who bought it. The point was it shouldn't be owned by the state. And so, yes, if we're talking about gangsters and dubious, corrupt figures and so forth, it didn't matter. The market would work itself out. Yes. So it was this mix of, in a way, Yeltsin's political ambitions and, frankly, the ambitions of a lot of people in his circle to make a lot of money, with American advisors who in some ways were giving them the excuse to do what they wanted to do.
But for an ordinary Russian citizen, it must have looked crazy. I mean, it was collectively owned. Wouldn't it have been better for the Russian state if it was kept owned by the state, so it could benefit in social terms or whatever?
The problem is that collective state ownership had become deeply tarnished by the Soviet experience, where you might say what was owned by everyone was in practice owned by no one. And the interesting thing was actually Russians themselves were given the opportunity to get into the privatization. They all had a voucher which would entitle them to buy shares. But of course, when you're starving, you aren't going to be sitting there thinking, well, I'll make an investment and in 10 years' time it may well pay off. So what happened is most of these vouchers ended up being sold, bought up in large numbers.
For a bottle of vodka.
Oh, I mean, exactly, or for just a few rubles. And the interesting thing is, I mean, I remember there would be people on street corners with signs around their necks saying, I buy vouchers. And people would come up to them. Now, who were these people? Who actually has the manpower
and the money?
And the money to precisely snap up this? Often it was organised crime, who would actually be out there buying up these vouchers, voucher here and a voucher there, and suddenly you have a lot, and either they would use it themselves to buy into strategic industries, or else they would then sell these bulk sort of shares to the rising generation of kleptocratic oligarchs.
But some of those persons you mentioned, we celebrate in the West, like Khodorkovsky.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to realise that not everybody who rose in the 1990s was completely corrupt. Now,
but I mean,
it's very hard to have made money in the 1990s and not cut moral corners.
Exactly.
I would be amazed if anyone actually remained honest and law-abiding and also was rich and alive through that period. But we're really talking about, in some ways, an inevitability. The same way as, frankly, every Soviet citizen had to pay bribes, because it was or work on the black market, because it was the only way you could survive. So in some ways, I think we have to acknowledge that there was a spectrum of grey. You have figures like Khodorkovsky, who I think were about as honest as you could be in that environment, and then other figures who are absolutely clearly people who use murder and corruption as a tool of their business strategies.
But could you say, see Russian history, political history, if you compare it to the Western democracy, it's like they have a lack of 70 years. I mean, they need those 70 years of training that we had.
Yeah. I mean, yes, it's interesting. I mean, 70, or some would say 700 years. I mean, look, I am not of the view that there's something inherently authoritarian in Russian DNA. Russia has particular challenges, including the simple size of the country, the vulnerability, economic issues. But nonetheless, I mean, it is clear that Russia has the capability to become a democratic liberal state, if it wants to, in due course. But if we look at, after all, as you say, democracies in the West have tended to emerge over decades or indeed centuries, or else they were essentially imposed from without. You know, basically, it was the Allies who wrote the West German Constitution after the Second World War. Or one can look at what happened to the new EU member states in Central and Eastern Europe, who basically were forced to conform to a whole variety of different rules. And yet one can question just how successfully
They are
that
still
has
poor.
genuinely, they're still often poor, but also in many cases, there are true success stories like the Czech Republic. There are other countries where actually it's clear that they have the forms of democracy, but if one looks at, say, Hungary today, or one could argue Poland, actually rather less successfully have they really got the culture of democracy. So we ought to acknowledge that this is a lengthy and painful process. And my view is, look, I don't think true democracy, is coming immediately to Russia. But what I think is very, very striking is the degree to which Russians have learned something about themselves. They have learned that they do not want to be powerless, just simply subjects of the state. And so whether it's the next political generation or more likely the generation after that, the people who are still at the moment, the 20-something-year-olds and so forth, people who've travelled, who have an idea of what they want. But I do think that democracy of some kind is coming to Russia eventually.
But even still, if you ask young people in Russia, they will say, no, we don't want the 90s again.
This is, our big problem is we in the West, in my opinion, although we can't be blamed for everything that goes wrong, but nonetheless we have to recognise in the 1990s we dramatically mishandled Russia. Firstly, we allowed the impoverishment of the overwhelming majority, and we allowed them to identify that with democracy. But secondly, we didn't really practice what we preached. We talked about the importance of democracy in Russia. In 1993, Boris Yeltsin shelled his own parliament because of a dispute. Technically, but constitutionally, at that point, he was no longer president. He then subsequently rewrote the constitution to say it was all right all along. It doesn't work that way. But nonetheless, because it was a Soviet-era hangover parliament full of unpleasant nationalists and communists, we in the West, we didn't want Parliament to win, so we basically praised Yeltsin for doing it. 1996, it looked as if the communists were going to win the elections. And again, we didn't want that. So when Yeltsin and a collection of bankers and media magnates rigged the election to make sure he got re-elected, we praised him as the great spirit of democracy. And we should be surprised that Russians think that democracy everywhere is a sham, that it's always managed and manipulated, and that we in the West are essentially hypocrites who talk the talk but don't walk the walk. I think this is it. We unfortunately, we allowed, in my opinion, the circumstances for the rise, not specifically of Putin, but of someone like Putin, precisely because we undermined Russia, we marginalized Russia, we ignored Russia, and we allowed people to assume that democracy meant poverty and lies.
Exactly, because still in Russia, many still view Putin as more or less the rescuer of the nation. Mm-hmm. How will that change in Russian minds?
I think we're already seeing, and we've seen it frankly for some time. In the immediate years after the 1990s, then gratitude for Putin saving the country. And we ought to notice, by the way, that a lot of this happened not because of Putin. It was anyway that the anarchy of the 1990s was already beginning to sort of bubble down by the time Putin came to power. So he has some role in restoring stability and indeed plenty to Russia, but we should note that he was also very, very lucky in his first couple of presidencies. But yes, absolutely, at the time in particular, time and time again when you talk to Russians, they would frame it as exactly the man who saved us from the 1990s. But that was a long time ago. And I think gratitude amongst populations tends to decline. And particularly now that we're seeing that in some ways the social contract has been broken. The essence of Putinism was a social contract. You stay out of politics, you let us run the country, and your life will get steadily better. You will know that your kids will have a better life than you, and so forth. People can't and don't have that kind of faith anymore. They actually see their lives getting slowly, not dramatically, but slowly getting worse. It's harder to be optimistic about the fate of your kids.
But
and in
because
that context,
of the war in Ukraine? Or?
It's a combination. It's largely because of the war and sanctions and so forth. But it's also, I think, frankly, that Putin is no longer the Putin of those era. He's a 71-year-old who's increasingly out of touch, increasingly not really, managing much of the country. and certainly nowhere near as connected to the Russian people as he was in the past. So for all these reasons, I think the 1990s is frankly heading back into history.
And also, many Russians, they prefer a strong Russian state, because if they just open up their doors, they feel, and they could have a point in that regarding the 90s, that the Western businessmen would just buy Russia for a nickel.
To be honest, I think actually many Russians wouldn't mind, being bought up. Because actually their experience of late has been when foreign companies come in, the McDonald's and so of this world, actually they bring with them a lot that's positive in terms of business practice and the like. I think that there isn't anymore the same fear. There isn't anymore this same sense of we have to kind of keep our borders strong and keep our state strong. That is very much what Putin is trying to push out in his propaganda. But I think it's having less and less traction with the Russian people. It's quite interesting. Obviously, it's very difficult in the current state, with Russia really being an authoritarian regime nudging into totalitarianism, to really get a sense of what the Russian people think. But people have done some inventive ways of trying to do surveys and polls of public opinion. And it's clear that, roughly speaking, the same way as only about 25% of Russians truly support the war in Ukraine, well, likewise, a lot of Russians don't believe that they need to be in a security state, that they actually would like to see reopened, borders with the West, reopened connections with the West, and so forth. But at the moment, in a way, the Russians don't get a choice as to whether that happens.
But could they, in the end, could the Russians have their own way of democracy and progress? Does it have to be something they more or less buy in the West?
Look, all countries ultimately have their own democracies. British democracy is different from French democracy, which is very different, I'm glad to say, from American democracy. So of course it's going to be democracy with some kind of Russian characteristics. The fundamentals are the important thing. The idea that sovereignty comes from the people rather than from above or from some sense of historic mission or whatever. So yes, of course, whatever democracy emerges eventually in Russia will be Russian. But the point is that is something that unfortunately will take time, and as I said, it's probably a couple of political generations away.
Just one generation, or?
I think it's 2 generations away. I think that sort of the next political generation, the people who are currently the 50-year-olds, the 60-year-olds, they are essentially ruthless, pragmatic kleptocrats. They may well bring rule of law, because in a way, once you've stolen everything, you want to legalize it. Particularly because a lot of them are getting older, they're beginning to think about succession, they're beginning to think about wanting to be able to hand it on to their
retirement.
Kids. Yeah, exactly. So you want a secure retirement for yourself, a secure transfer of wealth to your kids, and you need rule of law for that. As we saw, you can't have democracy without rule of law. That's the mistake they made in the 1990s. So if this next generation bringing rule of law, maybe the generation after that will be the ones who can then build on that to bring a working democracy. That's it's very positive, and I know I'm unfashionably optimistic about Russia's long-term hopes. But on the other hand, that I think is how it happened, and that's the kind of timeline. I don't think we can see an accelerated transition. It will take time, and it has to come, as I say, from the Russians. It's not something that the rest of the world can try and sort of dictate to Russia and provide a blueprint.
Final question. What do we say to people who say, well, the oligarchs of the West, they're just the same, they just wear a nicer tie?
Oligarchs are oligarchs regardless of where they are. The importance is, are the institutions in place to control them? This is the key difference. In Russia, if you're an oligarch who has the ear of Putin, you can get away quite literally with murder, and certainly in terms of you can take over what you want. In the West, to greater or lesser extents, we still do have rule of law, independent judiciaries, democracies, which can change governments when they decided to when they seem to be kind of crossing the lines. So yeah, oligarchs will be oligarchs wherever, but in Russia they have vastly more scope to do their dirty work.
But we can vote away our oligarchs.
Where's an oligarch? But an oligarch is just a particularly ruthless variety of rich businessmen. And so long as there is capitalism, just as there are poor people, there will be very rich people. And the point is, rich people, obviously are going to have more opportunities. But precisely what opportunities? Well, that's what's constrained by the institutions of the state.
We could have a long conversation about this. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.